Introducing the right-wing war on education, starring Betsy DeVos, evangelical Christians, and a few dudes who rented out strip malls, called themselves schools, and stole your public school tax dollars.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
In this hour, we'll talk about how Republicans want to dumb our kids down and what we have to do to stop them. As always, leading the conversation is Patty Vasquez. But with her, we have Kirk Bangstad of the Minocqua Brewing Company, who is leading the charge to get rid of the parasitic voucher school system in Wisconsin. And a few fellow public education warriors he brought along to educate us. The right-wing war on education is brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company. Take it away, Patty.
They are the backbone behind these shows and behind the advocacy for public schools throughout Wisconsin. Next, we have, thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thanks.
All right. Next, we have Michael Johnson. Michael, wave your hand while I talk. You're not the basketball coach, but you're the guy who looks really good in a tie right now. So Michael Johnson has been a superintendent in Eau Claire since 2020. Previously, he was a superintendent in River Falls for 11 years. He's a graduate of UW Eau Claire and Bethel University in St. Paul. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thank you.
And finally, and last but not least, we have the tallest member of our guest panel today, I'm guessing. He's a superintendent in Neillsville since 1997, and he is the Neillsville girls basketball coach, who apparently has won over 500 games. John has graduated from high school at Black River Falls, did his undergraduate degree at the famous Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, and then he had a graduate work in Winona State. He is recognized as a leader for both Wisconsin superintendents across both urban and rural districts and has received a number of honors and awards. Thanks a lot, John, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start everything out. We're going to get really deep into the rural aspect of voucher schools. But what I first wanted to start, let's start with Chris first. What brought you to public education? Why are you so committed to it? Where does that come from in your life history?
I was really glad you were going to ask this question, Kirk and Patty. In reflecting over the 40 years serving public schools and my community, I think the commitment kind of for everybody develops over time. As I grew as a public servant, public schools reflect their communities, so you feel that all the time. And I came into public schools right at the time that children with special needs, so that it was the mid-70s, were mandated to be served. It was fully funded, so I have that experience of what that feels like. I was part of making that service what it should be for every child with a disability and meeting the needs of all kids. We were providing programming both in school and in the homes, working seamlessly with children and families. Sometimes I went during a supper time, so adaptions and supports could be seamlessly embedded into daily routines right in their homes. And it often hit me that public schools were the only entity that opened its doors to all and held me to a higher standard because people's hard-earned money, their taxes, provided those services. I served many years on our union's negotiating team and saw what the workings of that was and what the budgets were. And I've witnessed many miracles happen in our public schools, but I've also felt for a longer period of time the millions of dollars cut from our public schools and the decimation of my union. Vouchers are just another layer, and we'll get into that tonight, of laws that take resources from our public schools. And then after I retired, I worked as an early childhood consultant across all the districts, CISA 10 and 11 in Western Wisconsin, saw those inequities on what that looks like and how broken that funding system is. And I stay engaged now as an organizer for the network because we still have work to do. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. And that feeds my engagement.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Michael, how about you?
Well, Kirk, I had a great experience as a public school student up in Phillips, Wisconsin, fairly close to you. And, again, thank you so much for the invitation and working with people like Chris over the last 4 years since I started in Eau Claire. And I've known John for quite some time. I was a coach when he was a referee. I actually played City League basketball with them, and it's just a pleasure and an honor to serve as a superintendent in Wisconsin, alongside John. But ultimately, I had a great experience as a young kid growing up in Phillips, and I had tremendous teachers, staff members who supported me, as well as a community that really valued education of its students. And however, I think probably the biggest aspect was my family. My family they're the biggest factor. My parents were dedicated to public service. My dad was a Chicago policeman in the 60s and 70s. He was a sheriff in Price County up in northern Wisconsin in the 80s. My mom was a teacher after a little bit of time in private industry. She was the director of North Central Technical College, the Wausau campus, Medford, Phillips, back in the 80s and 90s. And my brother is a special education teacher in Wisconsin as well. So public education is very important to my family. I've been in the field for over 30 years now, 10 as a teacher, 20 as an administrator in River Falls, Woodbury, Minnesota, in the last 4 years here in Eau Claire. Every year I serve, that commitment deepens, no matter the community or the district, and I'm proud to do so.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. How about you, John?
Well, thank you. And Mike is actually taller than I am. So,
I was going to say that, but
No way.
That's important to know. Mike talked about it a little bit, but I just think about the influence of my parents. My parents were Depression era parents, grew up during the Depression, had a deep passion for their work. They were both blue collar folks. My dad only went to 8th grade, did not get to go to the city school because he had to go to work for his father, who lost his farm in the 30s after 8th grade. But he had a passion for what he did. He ended up starting and owning 2 companies that I could have gone into, but his message to me was, it has to be your passion. You need to follow what you're passionate about. I think back to my teachers and coaches and advisors. And one of the things that my parents cherished was the opportunity that I had in a public school that they didn't have during the time that they were growing up. I think of the fine arts opportunities, the athletic opportunities, the classroom opportunities as well, and not have to worry about paying to do it. I think that's really important. I think one of the other things I found I took away from all of those people that touched my life was that nobody is nobody. Everybody is very special to somebody, and that we are required in our lives to do a greater good. And I couldn't find a greater good to do than to serve in public education. And this is my 42nd year in it. And I cherish every moment that I have. I've met some of the best people, the hardest working people I've ever met serving kids. And it's a humbling experience for me.
Thank you all so much for sharing your stories and your why. And clearly, as our off-camera contributor has noted, it's clearly a lot of commitment to public service and devotion to students and making sure they have everything that they need to prosper and really reach their potential. And now, John, you just mentioned that you've been at this for over 40 years, serving as a superintendent in 2 school districts for over 30 years. What kind of changes have you seen? What do you want to tell us about?
Well, I think that there's been a ton of changes, but I think the most important change that I've had to deal with is expectations. The expectations that are put on to our public school institutions now are just overwhelming. The things that are on our teachers' plates and the expectations for them is incredibly high and much more than what should be expected. But I think we have a society now that think that there is institutional responsibility for doing everything. One thing that I can say hasn't changed are the kids. The kids still come with the same needs that they've always had. They may be more sophisticated now because of all the technology they have access to, which is another big change in education, but they're not more mature and able to handle it. So we also have to help them figure that out, as well as all of the other things that are going on in their lives. But to me, those expectations, I think, are high. The other thing that's been a huge change, I think, is the divisiveness of politics. We used to be able to, you didn't see the divisiveness when we were working on budgets in the past, working on bills in the past. The divisiveness of politics now has really caused problems. And unfortunately, people that aren't necessarily in politics have started picking sides. And that has created more divisiveness. And I think that is a huge impact. The other big impact is the lack of staff. When I started, we would get 200 applicants for a position. Now it's tough to get two. So that has also impacted us a great deal.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I grew up in Stevens Point, going to school in the 80s and 90s, and I feel like I was part of a lucky generation, and I hope we can get that back, because I had just the most amazing teachers. I had a wonderful band teacher, a choir teacher, an orchestra director. My coaches were world class, I thought it, and now you got to pay for all that stuff, and it was all free for me. And so I totally understand what you're saying, and throughout the course of these shows we've been doing, there's this constant drumbeat of we don't have the funds that we used to have in public schools to offer the same types of things that a lot of us in our 40s had. And so, Michael, I wanted to ask you, you're, once again, for our audience, you're the superintendent of the Eau Claire School District. We're going to get into vouchers soon. I might follow up with a voucher question, but I wanted to understand more about, in your experience in public education, are you experiencing budget cuts, and what does that mean when the rubber hits the road, when you don't have as much money as you used to?
Well, certainly over the past 20 years in administration, I've experienced that. Interestingly enough, Chris, being a former board member in Eau Claire prior to my tenure here in Eau Claire, she could probably answer this question a lot better than I could. But there are so many impacts to our budget, as well as others, regardless of size, Neillsville, Phillips, Eau Claire. But for us, and John alluded to it, the ability to attract and retain high quality teachers and staff is impacted by that. And now it's becoming much more difficult with fewer students and student teachers coming out of our institutions. Some districts have had to implement salary freezes like Eau Claire had done a few years ago. And people still talk about that, years afterward. I think one main piece with the impact of vouchers on our budget would be deferred maintenance on our buildings in the district. It pretty much matches, like $1.8 million. And our district in Eau Claire, we've got 20 buildings, and many of them are older. They're in need of repair and renovation. But although we were able to pass a referendum last year, very proudly, the community certainly supported us. We impacted 9 of our 20 buildings last year in a successful referendum. We still have 11 other buildings and schools to maintain. So ultimately, though, programming, specific services for children are impacted. With that $1.8 million impact on us with vouchers, that could provide each elementary school in Eau Claire with behavioral intervention or a mix of literacy and math intervention across the district. And we hadn't had that before. Those things were lacking in Eau Claire in the past and weren't addressed because they're difficult decisions to make. I know that's impacted our budget and achievement and growth of our students prior to my arrival. And I think with COVID, the pandemic, the effects on students, it still is lasting.
So before we move to the next question, I just want to make sure our audience understands, because we've segued into vouchers. So budgets have been cut in public education in Wisconsin across the board, but specifically the voucher state, among the 4 voucher programs in the state, Milwaukee, Racine, the statewide program, and the special needs program, that has somehow displaced, you're saying, $1.8 million from the Eau Claire public school system. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so that's and is there, how many voucher schools are in the Eau Claire system?
I don't know exactly, but we've got our Regis, Eau Claire Regis area school system. in Chippewa Falls in our area, that's the McDonald system. I can't speak to the Marshfield area. John certainly could, but yes, those all impact us here in Eau Claire and the public schools surrounding us as well.
And we'll get into that in future questions. But the gist of it really is, and it's part and parcel of the lawsuit that we're bringing to the Supreme Court, is that it's arguably against the Wisconsin Constitution for people in Eau Claire to be paying taxes for their public school districts, but somehow through the state financing system of public schools, that money that Eau Claire residents are paying is actually going to other school districts' voucher schools, which is one of the things that we think might be illegal, and we're going to argue that it is from Wisconsin Constitution.
Yeah, and with that in mind, Chris, as a school board member and school board president, how do you explain the decline in state funding and vouchers for your community?
That's another really good question. When we went to referendum, when I was president of the board in 2016, we started to have kind of a way of explaining it. And Eau Claire was unique because Uniroyal had just closed. It closed in 1993 when the spending limits went in, the revenue caps. So we didn't levy to the max, which has hindered us ever since. So I think that that's an important message. And I know that the lawsuit too, per pupil, and the equity of all that is being addressed as well. So thank you for that. But I also then have to layer for people the other things that are pulling from the budget, such as the statewide voucher program, the special needs, and we haven't really talked about the new independent charters as well. So I run the voucher data for Senate districts and Assembly districts. So you're saying, well, the vouchers haven't really hit Northern Wisconsin or Western Wisconsin. That's not true. I just sat here and took Senate District 25, which I think is connected to both Eau Claire and Neillsville, but I think there's 40 districts that are touched by Senate District 25. 18 of those are impacted. That's almost half. So I think when legislators, when you look at the new increase too, there are some districts or some Senate districts, Jagler's for one, between last year and this year, $6 million increase to those districts over in his Senate district. And I have to think that those impacts and what that means in their Senate district could not have been known ahead of time for them to think and be, say that they are strong public school supporters, to think that that's okay. So I think that also we've had 16 years of no inflationary increase. Nobody knows that. How do you run what we need to do for all kids in Wisconsin, 800,000 of them, with no inflationary increase? So that's what I share. That's the conversation I have. Yep.
All right.
But to that, Kirk, we have one of our listeners, one of our viewers online asked, is part of your class action, because I know we didn't touch on that very much at the beginning because I raced in and we were trying to go live, but is part of your class action suit against the state of Wisconsin, outlining how people are being forced to contribute to religious institutions that they don't believe in? I mean, that's just a broad question.
That is a good question. By the way, it's not a class action suit. That's kind of just legalese. It's a suit. We're going straight to the Supreme Court to try to get a ruling from the Supreme Court. It would involve all school districts in Wisconsin. Honestly, there is a huge issue of separation in between church and state, obviously, with the voucher school program. A vast majority of students who take vouchers will go and use those vouchers in a religious school. There's a huge argument that says, why is public tax dollars going to private schools who are mostly religious? Honestly, we stayed away from that because to us, it's not, that becomes partisan, that becomes culture wars. And to us, there's a clear-cut tax issue that if you can be a Republican or a Democrat, and you don't, and it's just not right for you to be spending money for somebody else's kid to go to someone else's school like halfway across the state, your tax dollars. So for us, it was easier for us, and we were 100% right, and we think we're going to 100% win, and we don't even need to bring in the religious issue to win this case, and so we decided to not do it.
Great. And the notes are, I'm being told in the side off the wings that the Supreme Court has already ruled against the religious argument. So thank you for asking, Dale. Go ahead, Kirk. I wanted to get one of our listeners.
No problem. And so John, Chris just talked about how a vast majority of, looks like the Senate district, so it's like Western Wisconsin, includes Eau Claire and Neillsville, has been affected by these voucher schools, and a large chunk of these voucher programs go to Milwaukee and Racine. So the question is, being from rural Wisconsin, from Neillsville, when you have to face budget cuts and and you can talk about if there's money that's coming out of your district to go to voucher schools, how do you talk to people in your community? Do they understand this is happening, even that a large part of some of the budget shortfalls are coming because of voucher schools?
Well, I think in the Milwaukee Racine issue, I think that people in rural communities think that those communities are a world away from us, right? And whatever problems they have, it's their problems. And I think it also kind of goes with the question that's often surveyed of, what do you think of your public schools? And people love their own public schools, but they think other public schools are really struggling, that they really don't know anything about. To answer the question though about the funding, I think the short answer is no. People don't understand it. The Wisconsin school funding system is clunky to begin with. I mean, when we talk about revenue caps and general aid and categorical aids and special education funding and all of the different things like that, even to the point where people don't understand that little number at the top of your tax bill that says a levy credit is almost $1 billion now of money that's considered K-12 funding, and none of that money goes to a school district. All of that money goes directly for taxpayer relief. And as we talk about taxpayer relief with vouchers, we need to think about the fact that taxpayers are impacted by this. It's raising your public school taxes to take the voucher funds out of the general aid formula. And the people that it hurts the most are the most economically disadvantaged areas, because the general aid formula is to help them keep their property taxes in check based on their poverty. And the more that voucher money is taken out of that general aid, the higher the tax impact is on those communities, which to me is the reverse Robin Hood effect, right? We're taking money from the poor and giving it to the richer, which just doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, in my district, or in my Senate district, it's about 8.9 million that is being transferred into the voucher fund, and in the Senate districts, about 3.4. What's really interesting, though, is individual stories. Just a few years ago, the largest district around us, other than Eau Claire, is Marshfield. They're transferring 1.7 million. Now, they're significantly smaller than Eau Claire, but almost transferring that same amount to voucher schools out of their school system, out of their aid formula. So it is tremendously impactful. But do people understand it? No. People want to know what their own tax bill is for the most part. And quite honestly, people have a lot of trust in their local public schools. So they don't go down there and try to figure it out. They trust an elected school board and the administration to figure that out for them and have their best interest in mind.
For Marshfield, that's 5.7% of their budget goes.
Wow. We're talking about the right-wing war on public education. We have experts lined up. We have Michael, John, and Chris with us right now, brought to you, invited here by our incredible team, Kirk Bangstead and Julie Underwood. We're going to continue this conversation. We're going to turn our attention to how this impacts folks living in rural areas as well. Thank you so much for this important and dynamic conversation. We'll continue in a moment on WCPT 820 Heartland Signal and KTNF 950 AM Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Won't you let me die?
And now back to the right-wing war on education.
We are continuing our conversation about the right-wing war on education, and our fearless leader, Kirk Bangstead, who's leading the charge, joins us. The Nako Brewing Company brings you this incredible segment as we really do need to make sure people understand how voucher systems negatively impact public schools and the kids who really deserve a strong education. Kirk, where do you want to turn our attention to next?
All right, so I wanted to talk, Chris briefly alluded to independent charter schools. I wanted kind of Mike to kind of break some of this stuff down for us. So can you tell us more about what voucher, at least in northern Wisconsin or northern part of the state, what do you know, where are the voucher schools primarily located? Kind of what are the programs where the voucher programs that fall into? There's 4 programs in the state. I know the answer to this, but I want you to answer it. And then the one thing that Chris also alluded to earlier was something that very few people know anything about, which are the independent charter schools. Can you break down for rural people where these voucher schools are and what programs they fall into?
Sure, I'll do my best, and John and Chris, if you'd like to chime in as well, that's great. In our area, there are significant groups of voucher schools in our area under those programs. And yes, there are also independent charters with some interest in gaining traction in the area too. As I mentioned before, Eau Claire, Regis in Chippewa Falls, McDonell, those systems are long-standing in the community. We do expect, like I mentioned before, that more schools will start to exhibit that interest in our areas, in our region, kind of moving from west to east or from east to west across the state. One difference that I had noted recently is that this newer independent entity, the Pearson Company, of which we utilize their products in Eau Claire for our online learning platform, we have an Eau Claire virtual school. And we utilize Pearson products to assist us. And they're a great partner, a tremendous partner. We really appreciate the Pearson Company. But our Eau Claire virtual school is an entity of our district. That is a charter in our district. Anyway, the Pearson Company had approached us in the summertime about a non-instrumentality charter, an independent charter. And this differs from the longstanding systems of like a Regis and from Eau Claire and a McDonell school system. This is a private business that has shared with our school board that they view Wisconsin as a charter-friendly state. And again, this is the privatization that is occurring that really impacts our public schools. On the flip side, you've got Appleton, who has for 20 years had a tremendous online program for their public school students, and it's an instrumentality. It is part of their school district, so they receive that aid. But what Pearson approached us about is to be a non-instrumentality, where our virtual school in Eau Claire is not as robust quite yet. We're in the infancy with 4 or 5 years in, but they had mentioned, hey, we'll take all that administrative cost and the teaching off your plates as a private business. We'll take care of it, and then we will receive that aid. So again, the privatization really impacts us here in Eau Claire. They presented to our school board, and our school board not very interested, and I do believe the Pearson folks realize that as well. But again, we don't have that control. We don't have that opportunity to influence as well. Was it a possible revenue generator? Absolutely. And we wanted to explore that. But again, not to the cost of our public school students here and really impacting public school students statewide.
And to follow up with that, I don't know what the math is for Eau Claire, but in our lawsuit, we did the math for Madison, Wisconsin. And the math was if one student took a voucher to go to a private school, the public school system lost that state funding for about 5 students. So I'm not sure if it's the case there, but private school, the funding mechanism is different for vouchers. And if you're a for-profit company, you can make more money and give that money to your company as opposed to give it to those teachers or for the books or for the building enhancements. So it's not doesn't work out well for students and teachers and public schools when a private company tries to get in there and do the job.
Absolutely.
And here's the thing: is that I hear these arguments that, well, people should have a choice. Public schools aren't performing that well, and but their studies show that voucher schools don't perform better than public schools, and the kids aren't served better. We've discussed how public schools are often, we on this show we talked a lot about how schools are the lifeblood of the communities. So, John, tell me, if there's no proof that these voucher schools are better, why do they continue to grow at the expense of public schools?
Well, I think it starts with the false narrative that people never had choice before. I mean, when you look at the voucher program, a lot of those voucher dollars have gone to kids that were already in the private system. And I grew up going to elementary school in the 1960s, and there was a little Catholic elementary school in Black River Falls that operated without vouchers. There's a school, a little elementary school right now, a Lutheran school in our community that is not a voucher school. People have choice. People have always had choice. This idea that we've never had choice is just a false narrative, I think. But I think Mike touched on it with the privatization, and I think it's been a systemic effort toward privatization. I mean, when you're making political moves like this, I think it takes 2 steps. One is you have to discredit the current system, right? And then you defund it. And if you take a look at those 2 steps, we've seen that, and that becomes problematic. We hear about about book bans, about we want to change curriculum because it's indoctrinating our kids, or teachers are indoctrinating our kids. I mean, that's part of the discrediting that goes on that stirs people up to the point where now they'll support choice more and believe that they never had a choice before, which is just not true. The other thing is, we don't know a lot because we have different expectations. There are different requirements for the public school than there are for the private schools. So it's hard to necessarily compare apples to apples when we're doing those things. But every effort seems to be to discredit the public schools. And even through all that, I think what has really been a credit to the people that are serving our kids in our public schools, they haven't flinched in that. And they still are doing more and more work than they've ever done before to make sure their public schools are working for all kids.
Great. Thanks, Sean. So I wanted to now get into, I'm going to try not to get into the weeds too much on school financing because it's very complicated and it's hard for people to kind of wrap their minds around. Even our lawyers had to talk to economists at length in order to get this stuff. But from what I can gather, the gist of the matter is that the voucher school funding comes off the top of the entire pot of money that everybody pays in throughout the state of Wisconsin. And those voucher schools get their money first, and whatever's left is kind of divvied up and balanced out throughout the rest of the state of Wisconsin. So if there's more kids choosing vouchers, there's less money in the pot for public schools, which means that a kid's family in Milwaukee who takes voucher school funding and decreases that pot for the rest of the state is actually taking money away from a kid in Eau Claire or a kid in Neillsville or a kid in Minocqua, where I live, or Appleton or Oshkosh or Green Bay or whatever. So that is inherently, nobody intended for some kid's family in Milwaukee to take the money away from some kid in Neillsville. That's just not how public schools work. So Chris, now that I kind of want to explain that, to show to now I want you to tell me, because I think hopefully we ask you to do this research. I know it's a lot of research, but what are some of the hardest hit school districts in central, western, northern Wisconsin, most of the rural parts of Wisconsin, that are suffering the most at the hands of largely urban voucher school areas in southeastern Wisconsin?
Yeah, Kirk, it's hard to conceptualize it that way, because when you look up the data, you are assessed for the vouchers that are locally around you as well. Okay. Yeah. So we put together a road to referendum documentary back in 2016. Nothing's been changed except maybe the numbers, because nothing's been fixed and everything's worse. So I always say that, there's a pie, and it general purpose revenue. But what has happened over the years, without any debate or vote by me or you, general public, is that they've increased the programs. So I have a document you can look at that, when the vouchers started in Milwaukee and how many that was, and then Racine and da-da-da. Every time they put it in an omnibus budget, and passed it in the budget, they went, well, that went well. And the next year they started special needs vouchers. And then after that, we'll go with statewide program. So we have districts, and I have lists. I put the data together for the different Senate and Assembly districts. Marshfield alone, I have that pulled up here. Little Marshfield, $1,740,451.80 pulled from Little Marshfield. Loyal, now you wouldn't think of Loyal, $124,734. So, and I was looking at Eau Claire, just with the historic increases in those programs in this last budget a couple months ago when it was signed into law. Eau Claire's increase in 1 year was $500,000. So, there isn't one Senate district or Assembly district that hasn't been hit, and it hasn't been hit hard. It's just that these numbers aren't put together for the people to use them for their decision making. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It does. It does. And if we can see that this, the voucher program is measurably harming students in rural areas, Michael, why are politicians in those districts voting for this?
Well, I think it's the understanding. John could speak to that as well. I think it's the general understanding. Do I know that? Am I aware that there are party politics? Absolutely. I think in CISA 10 in this area, John and I are in that same region, and we've had legislators listen to us, and we were able to communicate with them. This past budget cycle, we traveled to Madison to meet with our legislators from the area as well. I think at times it is a bit complex, but I think we had groups of superintendents go down and meet with them individually as well as collectively with joint finance. John was our speaker in Eau Claire this past year and this past April, and that was tremendous to see both rural schools and schools like in Eau Claire stand together. And I also think it's that lack of understanding maybe by the general public, sometimes even our staff in our school districts, our families may not be aware. And once their constituents do speak to them and the impact on our rural schools, I was very fortunate to have Chris in our district during a referendum in 2016, where I think the word got out on an operational referendum like this is why we need to go to referendum, because of these types of situations with vouchers and things. But ultimately, I think it's that understanding and telling our story. Because if we don't tell it, somebody else will, creating that false narrative about how poor public schools are and such. But ultimately, I think it is that understanding. I
think too the data that's not fed to people ahead of a vote. For example, Senate District 23, 35 districts it touches. It includes the rural piece, Kirk, you're asking about. And I just looked at Senate District 23, over 35 districts. There's only 3 that have not been touched. All the rest have been touched.
Wow. So, public schools have gone through a lot in the last few years. I mean, in the last decade since Act 10, but in the last few years, I remember first hearing about, how we need to unmask all the kids. Somehow or another, masks became some divisive thing during COVID when it was proven that masks help reduce the spread of COVID, but we wanted to unmask and unmuzzle our kids. That seemed to be super political when it didn't need to be. And then we heard this thing about CRT, critical race theory, which seemingly has never been introduced into a public school K through 12 curriculum. It's mostly graduate school curricula, but somehow or another now this buzzword CRT is just making parents crazy. How could we possibly be teaching CRT? Well, what does CRT stand for? I don't know, but it sounds awful. It sounds demonic, And then finally, I've been hearing in the last year we have a Rainbow Land soda, and it came from that whole idea that we wanted to have a Rainbow Land soda came from the song Rainbow Land, which is a Miley Cyrus and a Dolly Parton song. And this teacher in Waukesha was trying to teach her kid this cool song. It was about acceptance and intolerance and just a feel-good thing. The Waukesha School District said she couldn't do it. She went on Twitter and said, I can't believe I can't teach my kids a song about rainbows. And she was fired for that. And because they're saying that she's indoctrinating them into some LGBTQ plus kind of world because of the word rainbow. So to me, it's like, why? What is happening? Why are they attacking public schools? Like, the public schools are the most innocuous place ever, and they're loving, they're wonderful. So John, what do you think is happening? What do you think is behind these attacks and this the politicization of public schools?
Well, I think this is a federal issue as well. This isn't just a Wisconsin issue. And again, it is that first step of discrediting, right? We want to create doubt in what's happening in our public schools. And, a lot of people, unfortunately, only go as far as a bumper sticker to get their information of what is going on, right? So I think that's problematic too. And when they actually go and find out, and again, I think in a lot of cases, it's people know it's not happening in their district, but doggone it, it's happening in every other district in the state of Wisconsin or in the nation, and it's just not true. But I think the other thing is it is an effort to. I think there is an effort by private business, to get access to taxpayer money, right? It's, if we want to talk about the free enterprise system, a lot of businesses are finding out if I can get access to taxpayer money, it really boosts my business, right? So I think that is a big part of it as well. I think the question of why do rural folks support the voucher program? Number one, they probably don't get questioned about it a lot by their constituents. Most constituents are happy with their school. And quite frankly, they need money to win their elections. And probably the greatest source of their funding comes from more of the southeastern portion of the state. That's why I always encourage my rural folks. I know that at some point you may have to take a vote on a budget that you might not necessarily want to, but you need to fight for us in your caucus. Make sure that you are letting people know how this is impacting your district. I think, the one thing when we look at not being able to get inflationary increases or in the funding system, it was because the state just didn't have enough money. But then all of a sudden they came up with the money to fund 2 systems. The legislature in this biennium increased the low revenue districts from $10,000 to $11,000, which was a huge lift for districts like mine. But then they lifted the grade 9-12 voucher to $12,000, so that my high school students in Neillsville are worth $1,000 less than the voucher kids. And that's what makes it hard. for people to understand. The other thing that I do need to say about these culture wars are this. One of the things that I am most proud of is that we serve every kid that comes to our door. If they're struggling with sexuality or anything else, we try to support them and their families as much as we possibly can to make sure that they are okay and that their families are okay. And that's one of the proudest things that I think public schools can stand on is it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. You're welcome here.
Great. I wanted to follow up on your idea of this. It's a strategy. First, you discredit the public schools, and then you discredit them by not funding them. You say they're being indoctrinated or all these negative things. Then you reduce funding, and then this public schools are not able to offer the same things that they were able to offer 20 years ago when we were in high school. And then, and by the way, this is happening worse in like Arizona. I just had to listen to a podcast where they're further along this strategy, because it's a strategy. It's a 30-year strategy. You discredit the public schools, you defund the public schools. All of a sudden, there is a need for something because the public schools are not able to do as much as they were able to do before. And so they're like, well, look, there's school choice. And now these schools are better funded than public schools. Maybe you should have a choice that was made a false choice. And then when students start doing it, they keep on expanding money for the school choice. They keep on reducing money, which creates a further gap. And then finally, that's a death spiral. The end game, which I hope we're not there yet. And I want to ask Chris how far along she thinks we are, but the end game is happening in other states where nobody is sending their kids to public schools because the differential is so great. So Chris, my question to you is, this is a 30-year strategy. I think it's been well documented throughout the country that these school choice lobbying groups are just trying to destroy public education. How far are we along in that, do you think, in Wisconsin compared to some other states?
Well, I spent 2 years on the county board as well. I stepped in for someone for 2 years, and I just came off of that. So put the fact that now many districts are planning with their communities to go to referendum every 2 years, okay? And they have to survive. And cities and counties now have referendums. So we keep track at the network what that looks like. And, people are going to make choices on referendum, as they go to the ballot box, and who are they going to pick? And now we divide and conquer our cities, our counties, and our public schools because we all need money because we're all being defunded. So that to me is scary. And I noticed that more in the last year when we voted the last time than I have ever before. Plus, we had more refs not pass. We've been successful and we're thankful, and communities love their public schools. But, when you're not funded at all, you got to go somewhere. And we're mandated to do what we're doing. So,
okay, Chris, thank you so much, Chris. We're almost away, and I got to talk about the next week's show before we cut off. So I appreciate you, and I'm sorry for cutting you off. Thanks so much, John. Thanks so much, Chris. Next week's show is our last show, and it's going to talk about the promise that the school choice lobby has given people of color. It's not real, that they will get a better education in voucher schools. We'll talk about race in the voucher program and the false promise they give to kids of color.
I really do want to thank all of our guests. Yeah, thank you. Extraordinary conversation. We're getting comments from people about how concise this was, and people are really understanding it. So thank you, Kirk, for shining a light on this incredibly important topic. That's our show tonight. Thank you, Alejandro and Matt Cummings here at WCPT. Mike Crudy's up next with Devil's Advocates. Have a great night, everybody.
You're listening to the Right Wing War on Education, brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company.